And I really was very scared. I said, that's not me. That's just not me.
Times when Robin and me would start to get apprehensive about what was going on, because at that point it was him about. He needed to realize that everyone around him was no longer going to support what he was doing and smile about it, you know.
He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pack his bags. He just stayed in the room long after the arguing stopped, long after the others had already decided they were done. No one asked him to stay. And for a long time, no one understood why he did. If you care about the real stories behind the legends, the moments they never explain, subscribe to RetroWaves. The room was quieter than it should have been, not peaceful, just emptied. This was the kind of silence that comes after something breaks, when the damage is already done, but no one has said it out loud yet. Maurice Gibb sat there, listening. He wasn't the loudest voice in the band. He rarely pushed himself to the front, and when things started to fall apart, most people didn't look to him for answers. But he noticed everything. He always did. What outsiders saw as tension or disagreement felt different from the inside. It wasn't one fight. It was a slow erosion. 1,000 small moments where trust bent just enough to never quite return to its original shape. And one by one, people began to leave. Some left out of anger. Some left to protect themselves. Some left because staying hurt too much. Maurice didn't. At least, not then. At the time, it didn't look like loyalty. It looked like indecision. Or maybe fear. Even those closest to him would later admit they weren't sure what he was thinking. Because Maurice rarely explained himself in the moment. He was the one who stayed behind after rehearsals. The one who sat quietly while others argued over direction and control. The one who tried to smooth things over without taking sides. But that wasn't the part that stayed with him. What stayed with him was the feeling that something was being lost, not all at once, but quietly, piece by piece, and that if he walked away too, it might disappear completely. There had been other moments before, earlier fractures, warnings, really, times when the group almost split, when the pressure became too heavy, when success felt more like a threat than a reward. Each time someone suggested stepping away. Each time Maurice hesitated, not because he didn't feel the same pain, but because walking away felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit yet. He had always been the middle brother, not the first voice people heard, not the one most headlines followed, but always there, filling the gaps, holding the structure together, making sure the music still worked even when everything else didn't. And that role, it came with a cost. People assume the hardest part of fame is the spotlight. For Maurice, it was what happened just outside of it, the quiet negotiations, the unspoken compromises, the responsibility of keeping everyone else from drifting too far apart. Years later, he would hint that this wasn't something he consciously chose. It was something that slowly chose him. There were moments when leaving would have been easier, moments when the tension turned personal, when words crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, when staying meant absorbing damage that wasn't his to carry. And still, he stayed. Not because he believed everything would magically fix itself, but because he wasn't sure who he'd be if he didn't. What happened next was never meant to be public. The private disagreements, the silences that lasted longer than conversations, the way trust shifted from something assumed to something fragile. Maurice noticed when phone calls stopped coming as often, when decisions were made without him in the room, when loyalty began to feel one-sided. And yet, even then, he didn't leave. There's a version of this story people like to tell, that he stayed out of weakness or habit or fear of starting over. But that explanation never fully fits, because Maurice was capable of walking away. He had talent, respect, options. He wasn't trapped. So the question lingers. Why stay when staying hurt? Why remain loyal to something that was clearly changing? Maybe even breaking? The answer wasn't about contracts or money or obligation. It was something quieter, something rooted much deeper than music. But at the time, even Maurice didn't fully understand it himself. He just knew that leaving felt wrong, not dramatic, not explosive, just wrong in a way he couldn't explain. And so, while others chose distance, he chose proximity. While others protected themselves, he absorbed the strain. And while the band's future became more uncertain by the day, Maurice Gibb stayed exactly where he was, hoping, maybe unconsciously, that his presence alone could keep everything from completely coming undone. It couldn't. But that realization hadn't arrived yet. Not in this room, not in this silence, and not in the part of the story people usually talk about. The distance didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as practicality. As time, as exhaustion, long stretches without speaking that were explained away as space, even though no one could quite define what that meant. Maurice felt it before anyone said it. He felt it in the way conversations shortened, in the way decisions were framed as already settled, in the way the music still existed, but the closeness around it didn't. He didn't confront it. That wasn't his nature. Instead, he adjusted. He learned when to speak less, when to soften a suggestion, when to let something go, even if it mattered to him. There's a common belief that staying is passive, that it means doing nothing. But for Maurice, staying required constant movement, emotional recalibration, restraint, compromise. And no one was applauding him for it. If anything, the longer he stayed, the more invisible his effort became. The band still functioned. The music still worked. From the outside, it looked like stability, but inside, something else was happening. Maurice began carrying a role no one had officially given him. Emotional ballast. The one who absorbed tension so it didn't sink the whole thing. The one who stood between opposing forces and tried quietly to keep them from colliding. And when it failed, he blamed himself. Not openly, not dramatically, just in small private ways. He replayed conversations, wondered what he should have said differently, thought about moments where he could have pushed harder or maybe stepped back sooner. He never said this publicly. But years later, traces of it surfaced in how he spoke. Short pauses, carefully chosen words. The kind of phrasing that suggests there's more underneath, but not everything is meant to be shared. What most people didn't see was how staying began to change him. The strain didn't announce itself. It showed up subtly, in restlessness, in quiet frustration, in the feeling of being necessary but not fully seen. And still, leaving didn't feel like an option. Because leaving meant breaking something he'd spent his entire life protecting. Not just the band, the bond. That's the part people often overlook. This wasn't just a professional relationship unraveling. It was family, history, shared childhoods and private languages no one else understood. Walking away wouldn't have just ended a chapter. It would have rewritten everything that came before it. Maurice couldn't bring himself to do that. So he stayed, even as the shape of the group shifted around him, even as loyalty became complicated, even as the question of why are we still doing this hung unanswered in the air. There were moments when others pulled back completely, when absence spoke louder than arguments ever had. Maurice filled those gaps. He showed up. He kept things moving. He held the center when the edges began to fray. But that wasn't the part that hurt the most. What hurt was realizing that staying didn't guarantee closeness, that being present didn't mean being included, that loyalty, when unspoken, can quietly turn into expectation, and expectation can be lonely. There's a scene people like to imagine, the dramatic breaking point, the moment where everything explodes and someone storms out. Maurice never had that moment. His breaking point was quieter. It lived in the long pauses after conversations ended, in the realization that no one was checking in on him the way he checked in on everyone else, in the subtle shift from being needed to being relied upon without being acknowledged. Still, he stayed, because leaving would have required admitting something he wasn't ready to face. That staying wasn't saving the bond, that it might actually be costing him more than anyone realized. But he didn't say that out loud, not then. Instead, he kept playing his part, dependable, steady, uncomplaining. The one people could count on to be there, no matter how complicated things became. And that reliability, it hardened into identity. Maurice wasn't just someone who stayed. He became the one who always would, which made the next realization even harder. Because somewhere along the way, he began to sense that the thing he was protecting might already be gone, replaced by something more fragile, more conditional. And if that was true, then why was he still there? That question followed him quietly, through rehearsals, through conversations that stayed surface level, through moments when laughter sounded real but didn't quite reach the same place it once had. He didn't answer it yet, but it was getting harder to ignore, and soon he would be forced to sit with it, whether he wanted to or not. Maurice didn't arrive at the truth in a single moment. There was no confession, no dramatic realization, just a slow understanding that settled in over time, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but doesn't let go either. It came to him in the spaces between things, in the pauses after conversations ended, in the way silence no longer felt temporary, in the realization that effort alone couldn't restore what had already changed. For a long time, he told himself that staying was still the right thing to do, that loyalty meant endurance, that family meant patience, that if he held on long enough, something essential would eventually return. But eventually, he understood something harder. He wasn't staying to fix what was breaking. He was staying because leaving felt like erasing himself. That was the part he never said out loud. Maurice had spent his entire life inside that bond, inside the music, the shared identity, the unspoken understanding that they were a unit before they were individuals. To walk away wouldn't have just been a decision. It would have been an unmaking. So he stayed, not out of obligation and not out of fear, but because staying was the only way he knew how to remain whole. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought grief, because it meant accepting that loyalty doesn't always protect what you love. Sometimes it simply preserves the memory of it. Maurice began to understand that what he was holding on to wasn't the present. It was the past, the childhood bond, the early closeness, the version of the group where nothing had to be explained. And once he saw that clearly, something inside him softened, not broke, softened. He stopped expecting things to return to the way they were, stopped trying to carry more than his share, stopped measuring his worth by how much he could absorb. He was still there. But he was there differently. Years later, when people asked why he stayed through the hardest moments, he never framed it as sacrifice. He didn't dramatize it, didn't portray himself as a victim, didn't claim credit. He spoke about responsibility, about love that doesn't announce itself, about being present even when the outcome is uncertain. But there was something he didn't say, that staying also cost him. It cost him ease. It cost him lightness. It cost him the ability to step away from something that was quietly wearing him down. And yet, he never spoke with regret, because regret would have meant believing there was another version of himself who could have chosen differently. Maurice didn't believe that. He believed that some people are built to leave, and some are built to remain, not because it's easier, but because it's who they are. Near the end, those closest to him noticed a change. He was calmer, less reactive, more accepting of silence, as if he had finally stopped arguing with the shape his life had taken. He didn't talk about the past much, but when he did, it wasn't bitterness that surfaced. It was tenderness, a quiet acknowledgement that staying hadn't saved everything, but it had allowed him to love fully, without conditions, even when it hurt. And for Maurice, that mattered, because the truth was never that he stayed when others left. The truth was that he stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning the part of himself that believed connection was worth enduring discomfort for, even when it wasn't returned in equal measure, even when it couldn't be fixed, even when it quietly changed him. In the end, Maurice Gibb didn't stay to hold the band together. He stayed to remain faithful to who he had always been. And that choice, unseen, uncelebrated, and deeply human, is the part of his story that lingers longest. Not as a lesson, not as a warning, just as a quiet truth. Some people don't leave. They stay, and they carry the weight of that decision long after the room is emptied.